I think as an investor community, we are at a crossroads. So we have been looking, the ones who have been investing in for a long time, we're asking ourselves, how do we look at the results of COP? So China's not there. India has delayed a contribution to it. America is not going nearly fast enough. And so you then have to be very, very clear-eyed about whether this is we are going to have a 3-degree rise in temperature. And I think the answer is yes. So I'm not one for pessimism or optimism. I like to try and make sure we deliver clear-eyed reality for investors, because that's the only way you assess risk properly.
Having this happen at the time of another form of global disaster like the COVID pandemic has also, I think, focused people's attention on the need for global action. So I do think there is that increased sense of urgency.
GFAN's announcing it would now has 450 members, represent $130 trillion in assets already. How important is that development, and what needs to happen next to move from commitments to actual funding?
Yeah, I think it is potentially hugely important, and I think I use the word potentially because I think that, and again, this is an area where among the cognoscenti, there's been some skepticism about the extent to which this is actually going to be deliverable. I think those commitments are going to have to be complemented. There's work going on, for example, with the International Financial Accounting Standards Board, and they've now they're in the process of trying to establish sustainability standards. And I think that in order for corporates and for financial institutions to take this on and really accelerate, it's going to be very useful to have those kinds of complementary activities on the the regulatory front and in the accounting profession and all that stuff, because I think it's just key. These businesses still are going to need to respond to their investors. The investors are going to need to see quantification of the risks and returns. And the net zero pledges also we have to ensure that they are authentic and are authentically enforced.
We put in a lot of work in the last decade and beyond, and unfortunately tropical deforestation is still going up. So in 2020, for example, tropical primary forest loss was 12% higher than the previous year. And yet 2020 was the year that we were supposed to be cutting tropical deforestation in half under the New York Declaration on Forests. So we're way off our targets. And of course, that has huge implications for the climate. The IPCC estimates that deforestation is about 13% of human-caused CO2 emissions. So another way to put that is if tropical forests were a country, it would actually rank third behind the US and China. So it's a big problem. Our work starts with, but does not end with monitoring. What I think we do really well at WRI is figuring out how to get the right information in the right hands to affect change, because we deeply understand that at the end of the day, data doesn't create impact, people do. The big change we want to see right now that's motivating us at Land and Carbon Lab is to rapidly scale up investment in an implementation of nature-based solutions to climate change. Ending deforestation, of course, is one of these solutions. If we want to stay on a 1.5 degree pathway, we also need to restore millions of hectares of forests and other degraded ecosystems. We also need to radically transform agriculture. So these are really big, complicated, and ultimately quite interconnected challenges. So we understand that we can't tackle those problems in silos. And I think what the Land and Carbon Lab is trying to do is provide the independent data that can power more holistic strategies, create accountability, foster trust, et cetera.
GFANS is actually an alliance of alliances. So RockCreek comes in through the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. I come in through my role as chair of the investment committee of the David Rockefeller Fund, which is a member of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. You also have the Net Zero Banking Alliance and other alliances across GFANS that make it up. What's remarkable is that yesterday we announced that across its membership, GFANS is now convening around $130 trillion in capital and over 450 members. So the
That's
world
terrific.
is rightly asking, what is this? What are these standards? And I really wanted to make sure to call viewers' attention to the progress report that we released yesterday. It's over 100 pages of detail on exactly what we're doing across our 7 work streams and what our forward-looking goals are. It's important to remember that GFANZ was just founded 6 months ago, and a lot of
so you've done a lot already.
Is forward-looking, exactly. When I think about progress at COP26, of course, it's really exciting to see how the private sector has stepped up. People repeatedly say that this is unprecedented across the history of all COPs. In addition to what I describe about GFANZ, the Race to Zero, which represents the corporate sector beyond finance, is now representing over 10,000 members, non-state actors of all kinds.
What do you see as the challenges and opportunities looking ahead in implementing the decisions that have already been made and we hope will be made in the next, 24, 36 hours at COP26?
Thank you, Caroline. We could literally speak for 4 days on this, but
Yes.
if I could just summarize, I think coming out of Glasgow, there's a few areas that we have to focus on going forward. One is simply accelerating the emission cuts. How do you do it? What do you do? Is it through technology? Is it through other sort of instruments? How do you accelerate emission cuts around the world? Not just developing countries where we are active, but around the world. Second is, as I heard when I was there, the finance. How are you going to do this? Who's going to do what? About the 100 billion commitment made for the developing countries by 2020, which kind of didn't materialize, kind of did. Now we're talking about much larger numbers, for almost 4.5 trillion per year. For mitigation or for climate, and another 4.1 trillion cumulatively for biodiversity. These are huge numbers. So the question becomes, where does the money come from? What are we doing about it? What is the world doing about it? GFANZ was you mentioned GFANZ, very interesting initiative. Again, it's a step forward. It's a lean in. It is an indication of intent. A very important, very moneyed entity saying we want to do something about this. So how do we do something about this?
We have very high expectations for the COP, in particular, maybe the Glasgow COP, because we went without a COP last year during the worst of the COVID crisis. And I think now we have these grand expectations, and there are limitations to what the Conference of Parties can achieve. And part of that is related to diplomacy and the establishment of agreements and very different interests. And so you see some of those different interests playing out and compromises being made. And so, going forward, I think we just have to look at what countries are doing when they go back to their home turf and what they're implementing on the ground to achieve their pledges and hopefully tighten up their pledges over time. So I think it's a fantastic signaling effect, but it really depends on what happens on the ground afterwards. And I think when we think about the 100 billion, there's a number of different elements that can go in there, including from private capital markets, as well as from government actors and using national budgets and development aid. And when we look at those mix of financing sources, what we need to do is target different types of climate action.
The thing that's really interesting now is getting to the granular level of how that marathon's going to be run. So we have asked them in a very non-judgmental way, and this is my pro bono role, not my day job, where we work with large, so we only have C-level, CEO level participants, some of the largest companies. We have organized them by sector groups, and what we're planning to do with each of these roundtables, whether it's commercial real estate or building and construction, is 10 to 15 CEOs of the largest companies in the UK discussing their climate journey in granular detail. So we've got them to say, where are you now? What's your pledge? How long are you going to take? That's the easy bit. We then get them to do the second level, which is how much of that is an easy win in your eyes? How much of that is programmatic change? So you're going to have to put resource behind it. And how much of it is innovation led? There is always hope for our planet.
Yes.
Our planet will go on. I don't know if there's hope for us as a species, and that is the point. You know, the planet is incredibly resilient in its multitude of operations, but as COVID has shown us, as you know, we're fragile. We're far more fragile than the planet is, and we will ruin it. It will, you know, we will face the repercussions of increased variance. We may not survive that, and I think that's something that people are starting to realize. It's the symbiosis there.
I think it's going to be important to keep an eye on what, you know, for investors, where are going to be the opportunities, and also there are going to be other areas in which where asset allocations may have focused, and where security selection is focused, where we're going to want to look again and try to and readjust our thinking about what's going to be the most appropriate for it. But I think that's going to be it, and I don't underestimate for a minute the complexity of doing it. But I think that if it actually occurs, it's going to create a major shift in the economic dynamics, and as a result in profitability. There was an article in Nature recently, the science magazine Nature, and they were talking about all the various pledges, the methane pledge and the coal phase out pledge and deforestation. And there was a very succinct comment that said, it's easy to make long-term promises, but hard to make the difficult short-term decisions that are required to meet them. And I think that, you know, that's
exactly. It's not just hand waving. We're talking about the real things and specific opportunities. The insight here is, if you believe this is for real and action is absolutely necessary, then the question is, okay, where do we start and what do we do? And rather than sit back and say somebody else should do something.
We see the financial sector coming on board in a more significant way. And that's really important, because getting deforestation out of their lending and investment portfolios really helps to put the pressure on the companies. I'd also say that, you know, even though we failed on 2020, the effort we all put in over the last decade, it wasn't for naught, right? So we learned a lot, we innovated a lot, and I think of it as like training. So we are now in much better shape to tackle this next decade worth of commitments. But at the end of the day, you know, we still need to see these commitments translate into concrete national targets, strategies, actions, and we're going to need a lot of domestic political pressure to hold leaders accountable to following through. Otherwise, you know, we will blow through the 2030 goal just like we blew through the 2020 goal. Can we translate all this high-level political commitment into concrete strategies and actions at the country level, at the state level, city level? One thing that looks really different to me now compared to 10 years ago is that climate change is so much more real and present and urgent for the average person than it was before. You know, so more and more people are feeling the impacts of climate change in their lives. And while on one hand, that's quite terrifying, to me, it's also a reason for hope, because ultimately politicians aren't going to follow through on these commitments unless we ask them to over and over and over again. So look for whether that public accountability really shows up in the next couple of years.
The private sector can't go it alone. We really need our policymakers to step up and support us in our objectives and commitments that are science-based. But I guess I'm also surprised and disappointed that some folks' ambitions don't seem to be rooted in science or long-term strategy. And so I hope that we can find ways to bring together what's in our hearts and our visions and our dreams with the serious pathways that are available to us. And also that we can continue to use technology, innovation, policy changes to make our forward-looking pathways better.
Where we are as a world today is that we were already beset by the climate crisis and, let's say, biodiversity crisis. Then we were hit by the pandemic. And so it was really a diverse set of crises that hit us as humanity. And what we learned out of that was the following, that these crises are connected, that it's not just about It's not just about finding technological solutions or financial solutions to crisis. It's about the social solutions, the solutions around social equity and inclusiveness, that the need that any solution that you construct for a climate issue or for a biodiversity issue has to be intentionally inclusive, because if it's not intentionally inclusive, it probably won't be inclusive. And so what we at UNDP do is make sure that we bring in, whether it's gender, whether it is other stakeholders of society, we try to bring them to the table in constructing. Women basically are important agents of change for climate action, because they are directly involved in various climate-related or climate-intensive sectors, such as agriculture, such as energy, cooking and whatnot, such as even transport and logistics. And therefore, women are an important stakeholder to the overall issue of how to deal with the climate issue. What, should they be at the table? 100%. Are they at the table? Not so much. But what UNDP is very proud to say is that, do you know that the majority of the NDCs that we have worked on with countries have gender plans in them?
When we start talking about more and more trillions of green labeled capital movement, that stretches a system that is based on the burden of proof for green issuers. And I think ultimately where we want to be is having this burden of proof on those that are doing actually climate harmful activities, and making more of an even playing field. And that's certainly possible if we act now and if we act in a systematic and very broad way. And so that's hopefully the case. But in the meantime, we have to be prepared that these events are going to happen, and they will have financial impact, they will have societal impacts. And therefore, the main takeaway is that we can't ignore this anymore. I think every company, no matter what sector, no matter what region, needs to be paying attention and starting their resilience planning. They'll either be impacted directly through infrastructure impacts or indirectly via supply chain impacts. So I think the key message is rather grim, that no one is safe from this, but it also has this hopeful element that we can turn ourselves back from the worst of this if we are careful about how we act right now.